Hello YouTube! We are on the Real Programming channel. It's about HTML and CSS. My name is Andrei. This is our 57th lesson. I greet you. We will talk about the ID attribute and exercise while you're drinking that iced tea. Try your hand at adding a border radius. Use a guarantee paragraph. We have got some examples below of the guarantee paragraph is a variety of borders radius values set. Write the CSS to create the border you see in the example. For each example, we have provided the size of the border radius used to create the render corners in that example. Okay, and brain power. Choose whether you'd see class or ID for the following elements: ID or class, a paragraph containing the footer of a page, a set of headings and paragraphs that contain company biographies, and or an image element containing a picture of the date, a set of P elements containing movie reviews, an O element containing or U to-do list, Q elements containing Bukhara Banzai quotes. Choice ID or class. The ID attribute, because you already used its on A element, and because you already know how to use the class attribute, you are not going to have learned much to use the ID attribute. So, say you have a footer on your page. There's usually only one footer on my page, so that sounds like the perfect candidate for an ID. Here's how you would add the identifier footer to a paragraph that contains the footer text. Okay, footer. So footer. Look, similar to a class, just add the attribute ID and choose a unique ID name. Unlike a class, you can only have one element in your page with an ID or footer. Each element can have only one ID. No spaces or special characters are allowed in ID names. Giving element in ID is similar to adding elements to a class. The only differences are that the attribute is called ID, not class. An element can't have multiple IDs, and you can't have more than one element on a page with the same ID. There are no double questions. What's the big deal? Why do I need an ID? Just to prove something is unique on the page, I could use the class exactly the same way, right? Well, you can always simulate a unique ID with a class, but there are many reasons not to. Say you're working on a web project with a team of people. One of your teammates is going to look at a class and think it can be reused with other elements. If, on the other hand, she sees an ID, then she is going to know that's for a unique element. There are a couple of other reasons IDs are important that you won't see for a few chapters. For instance, when you start positioning elements on your page, you need each element you want to position to have a unique ID. Can an element have an ID and also belong to a class? Yes, it can. Think about it this way: an ID is just a unique identifier for an element, but that doesn't prevent it from belonging to one or more classes, just like having a unique name doesn't prevent you from joining one or more clubs. But how do I use it in CSS? You select an element with an ID almost exactly like you select an element with a class. To quickly review, if you have a class called specials, there are a couple of ways you can select elements using this class. You could select just certain elements in the class like this. Color red. P specials. This selects only paragraphs that are in the specials class, or you can select all the elements that belong to the special class like this. They select all elements in the special class Using an ID select is very similar. To select an element by its ID, use a hash mark character in front of the ID. Compare this to class where I use a dot in front of the class name. Say you want to select an element with the ID footer. We select any element that has the ID footer, or you could select only a P element with the ID footer like this. This selects a P element if it has the ID footer. The other difference between class and ID is that an ID selector should match only one element in the page. Using an ID in the long, our guarantee paragraph really should have an ID since it's intended to be used just once in the page, while we should have designed it is that way from the beginning, making the change is going to be quite simple. Step 1. Change the class attribute to an ID in your long HTML file. Just change the class attribute to an ID. Step 2. Change the guarantee class selector in your long CSS to an ID selector. Just change the dot to hash in the selector. And step 3. Save your page changes and reload the page. Well, everything should look exactly the same, but don't you feel much better now that everything is as it should be? There are no dumb questions. So why did you make the selectors hash guarantee rather than P hash guarantee? We could have done either and they both would select the same thing. On this page we know that we will always have a paragraph assigned to the ID, so it doesn't really matter and the hash guarantee is simpler. However, on a more complex set of pages, you might have some pages where the unique ID is assigned to say paragraph and on other is assigned to a list or a block quote. So you might want several rules for the ID like P hash sum made and block quote hash sum made depending on which kind of element is on the page. Should I always start with a class and then change it to an ID when I know it's going to be unique? No, you'll often know when you design your pages if an element is going to be unique or not. We only did things this way in the chapter because, well, you didn't know about ID when we started, but don't you think we tied the ID into the story rather nicely? What are the rules for class and ID names? Class names should begin with a letter, but ID names can start with a number or a letter. Both ID and class names can contain letters and numbers as well as a character, but not spaces, so number 1 works, as does main content, but not header content. Just remember it must be unique. Mixing style sheets. Before we wind this chapter down, let's have a little fun remixing some style sheets. So far you've been using only one style sheet. Well, whoever said you can't use more than one style sheet? You can specify a whole set of style sheets to be used with any HTML but you may be wondering why anyone would want to. There are a couple of good reasons. Here's the first one. Imagine that the first long text of gets franchised, does the IPO and so on, all thanks to you and your terrific web work, of course. Then there would be a whole corporate website with hundreds of pages, and obviously you'd want to style those pages with external CSS style sheets. There would be various company divisions and they might want to tweak the styles in individual ways. And the long franchises also might want some control over style. Here's how that might look. Corporate say for us, we've set up all the main styles to be used by the company website, fonts, color and so on. Beverage division. We use all the corporate colors and fonts, but we add a few special touches of our own, like a different line height. And the still long part of the beverage division, we got a young hip clientele. We tweak the colors a bit and add a little edge, but overall, we use the division main styles. Using multiple style sheets. So, how do you start with the corporate style and then allow the division and the long franchises to override and make changes to the styles? You use several style sheets like this. In your HTML, you can specify more than one style sheet. Here we got three. One style sheet for the entire corporation, and the long settle has its own tweaks in the style sheet. Order matters. The style sheets can override the styles. In the style sheets linked above it, the beverage division can add to the corporate style a little, or even override some of the corporate styles. And this is our 57 level lesson is over. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to my channel, please. Like, share with friends, comment. Eat bananas, chocolate, and nuts. Drink more water for the effective work of our brains. Bye.